Welcome back to U.S. Command Insight. Tonight, the Persian Gulf has crossed a threshold that no amount of diplomatic language can walk back, that no Pentagon press conference can reframe into something manageable, and that no administration in Washington can absorb without fundamental consequences for its strategic posture, its domestic political standing, and its credibility before every ally and every adversary on the planet simultaneously. 4 United States Navy destroyers are on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. Let that statement settle for a moment before we proceed. Not damaged, not retreating, not filing incident reports. On the bottom, the USS ships that carry the most visible symbol of American naval power into the world's most strategically critical waterway have been engaged, overwhelmed, and sunk by 200 CARS anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from Iranian launch positions along the coastline and from mobile platforms dispersed across the Iranian strategic geography. The engagement lasted less than 40 minutes. The result will last for decades. The Khalij farce, whose name translates directly as Persian Gulf, is not a weapon that appeared overnight. It is the product of Iran's most concentrated and most strategically focused military development program of the past 15 years. A program specifically designed to answer one question with lethal precision: how does a nation without a blue water navy deny the world's most powerful maritime force the ability to operate freely in the waters that Iran considers its strategic domain? The answer that Iranian engineers and military planners developed, refined, and have now operationally validated is sitting on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz in the wreckage of 4 American warships. The Pentagon's public response has been, in the clinical language of strategic analysis, paralyzed. Not cautious, not measured, not strategically restrained, paralyzed. The institutional machinery that exists to translate American military power into coherent political responses has encountered an event for which its planning frameworks, its escalation management protocols, and its public communications infrastructure were not adequately prepared. The silence from the highest levels of American military command in the hours following the engagement has communicated more strategic information to every government on the planet than any statement could have. In the Strait of Hormuz tonight, 20% of the world's traded petroleum has stopped moving. The tanker fleets that carry the energy lifeblood of the global economy have scattered or halted the insurance markets that make global shipping economically viable, have suspended coverage for the entire Persian Gulf region. The financial markets that process the implications of energy supply disruption at the speed of algorithmic trading have already begun. The price discovery process that will transmit this engagement's economic consequences to every household on the planet within days. What exactly happened in those 40 minutes that changed the world? What is the CARS missile system? How was it developed? And what does its operational success reveal about the depth of Iran's anti-access capability? How does Washington respond to the loss of 4 destroyers without triggering the escalatory cascade that its own strategic planners most fear? And what does a world look like in the aftermath of the day that the United States Navy was driven from the Strait of Hormuz? This analysis will answer those questions with the depth and specificity that an event of this magnitude demands. No management, no sanitization, the truth as the strategic evidence reveals it. Before we go further, if this channel gives you the analysis that the institutions of mainstream information management will not hit, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think the sinking of 4 American destroyers means for the future of American power in this region. Every perspective matters, Every comment builds the picture. Part 140 minutes that changed the world. The engagement at Hormuz. To understand what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, you must first understand the geography of the engagement space and why that geography has always made this waterway the most strategically dangerous body of water on the planet for surface naval forces operating without air. Superiority. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point is approximately 33 kilometers wide. For a naval vessel operating in this space, the Iranian coastline is never more than a few minutes of flight time away from any weapon system capable of crossing that distance. The Iranian side of the strait is lined with a geography of hills, valleys, and coastal features that provide concealment for missile batteries, radar systems, and the command and control infrastructure that coordinates their employment. The strait itself is shallow enough and narrow enough that the standard naval defensive maneuver of creating standoff distance, putting enough water between a surface vessel and a threat to allow defensive systems reaction time is simply not available. The 4 American destroyers that entered this environment were operating as part of a show of force deployment ordered in the context of the escalating regional crisis. The political logic of the deployment was straightforward. Visible American naval presence in the strait communicates commitment, reassures allies, and signals to Iran that American deterrence remains credible and operational. This is a logic that has governed American naval deployments to the Gulf region for 4 decades, and it has generally produced the intended effect. What it had not fully accounted for was the specific operational capability that Iran had positioned along the coastline and in the mobile deployment architecture inland. A capability designed precisely to defeat the show of force logic by making the show of force catastrophically expensive. The engagement began in the pre-dawn hours when Iranian radar and surveillance systems, which have been tracking the destroyer formations movements through the strait for hours, determined that the tactical geometry had reached the optimal parameters for the engagement sequence that had been planned and rehearsed across years of preparation. The formation was at its most constrained. Limited maneuver room, predictable track, distance from air support that would require time to close. The first salvo of Khalij Fars missiles was airborne before any of the 4 destroyers' defensive systems had generated a threat warning. The ballistic trajectory of the Khalij Fars launching high arcing across the atmosphere, then diving steeply toward its target in the terminal phase, presents a fundamentally different engagement challenge than the flat sea skimming trajectory of conventional anti-ship cruise missiles. The steep terminal dive compresses the reaction time available to close-in defensive systems. The angle of arrival makes certain defensive intercept geometries geometrically impossible. 50 missiles in the first salvo were distributed across the 4 vessels, targeting not just the ships themselves, but the specific sensor and defensive system locations that Iranian intelligence had identified as the critical nodes of the Paralyzed destroyer's defensive architecture, radar arrays, missile launcher positions, communications, antenna. These were the initial aim points designed to degrade the vessel's ability to respond to the subsequent salvos before those salvos arrived. The second salvo followed within minutes before the defensive systems that had survived the first wave could fully reorient. This wave carried the heaviest warheads in the car's inventory weapons designed to penetrate the hull and detonate in the machinery spaces and magazine areas where catastrophic damage could be most efficiently achieved. 2 destroyers were struck multiple times in this phase and began taking on water immediately. The third and fourth salvos, totaling over 100 additional missiles distributed across the engagement, were directed against the vessels that had not yet been fatally struck and against any defensive systems that were still attempting to generate intercepts. By the time the engagement sequence concluded, All 4 destroyers had been struck by multiple warheads. The terminal damage assessment confirmed what the engagement data had indicated from the second salvo onward. None of the 4 vessels would remain above water. The human dimension of this engagement, the sailors aboard those vessels, the training and experience they carried, the families who will learn what happened cannot be reduced to strategic analysis. The loss of life in an engagement of this scale represents a human catastrophe that compounds the strategic shock in ways that affect every subsequent decision made by every actor in this crisis. American military culture takes the loss of its personnel with an institutional seriousness that shapes political responses in ways that purely rational strategic calculation cannot fully predict. In the immediate aftermath, American naval assets in the broader Gulf region executed a tactical withdrawal to positions outside the assessed engagement envelope of the Iranian missile architecture. This was a sound tactical decision that prevented additional losses. It was also in the strategic language that every government on the planet reads fluently a retreat. The United States Navy withdrew from the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian fire. The implications of that sentence are still being processed in every capital that has oriented its security policy around the credibility of American naval power. Part 2. The weapon that sank the destroyers, Khalij, FARS, and Iran's anti-Axis architecture. The Khalij FARS missile is the operational expression of a strategic insight that Iran's military-industrial complex reached in the early years of the 21st century and has pursued with remarkable consistency, sophistication, ever since. That insight can be stated simply: the United States Navy's surface combatant force, for all its technological sophistication and operational experience, is fundamentally vulnerable to a specific class of threat that its defensive systems were not optimized to defeat the anti-airship ballistic missile with maneuvering terminal guidance. Understanding why this vulnerability exists requires understanding how American naval air defense was designed. The Aegis combat system, the integrated radar and missile defense architecture that equips American destroyers and cruisers, was developed in the Cold War context of defending against Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles. These weapons fly relatively flat trajectories at supersonic speeds, presenting a specific engagement geometry that Aegis was designed to handle. The system is genuinely formidable against this threat class. It has been continuously upgraded and has demonstrated impressive performance in testing environments. The Khalij FARs attacks from a different geometry entirely. Launched on a ballistic trajectory that carries it to altitudes where conventional air defense radar coverage is less effective, it then executes a terminal maneuver phase that combines the steep dive angle of a ballistic reentry with active guidance of a precision munition. The result is a weapon that arrives from an angular direction that compressed range defensive systems struggle to engage effectively. Moving at velocities that compress the available reaction time to seconds with a maneuver capability in the terminal phase that makes fire control solutions calculated earlier in the trajectory inaccurate by the time the intercept missile Ares. Iran began developing this capability after carefully studying the limitations exposed in American and Israeli naval defensive exercises, and after acquiring technical knowledge from multiple sources, including Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile development programs and Russian engineering consultation. The DF-21D anti-airship ballistic missile developed by China provided a proof of concept that Iran studied extensively. The Khalij FARS is Iran's indigenous adaptation of this concept, scaled and optimized for the specific engagement geometry of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The guidance system of the cars combines inertial navigation for the boost and mid-course phases with an active radar seeker in the terminal phase that provides the autonomous target acquisition and tracking capability that makes the weapon effective against maneuvering surface. Vessels. The seeker can discriminate between vessel types, prioritize targets based on pre-programmed targeting criteria, and make terminal guidance corrections that compensate for both vessel maneuver and defensive jamming attempts. The warhead carries sufficient explosive mass to cause catastrophic damage to a destroyer-class vessel with a single hit. And the engagement tonight involved multiple hits per vessel. The 200 missiles fired in the engagement were not all Khalij FARS variants. The salvo architecture integrated several complementary systems that created the layered multi-threatment environment that overwhelmed the destroyer's defensive capacity. C-802 anti-ship cruise missiles, a system Iran has operated for decades and has continuously upgraded, were fired simultaneously from coastal batteries, creating a lower altitude threat that forced the Aegis systems to manage multiple simultaneous engagement tracks across different altitude bands and approach vectors, nor missiles. Iran's domestically produced variant of the C-82, with improved guidance and electronic countermeasure capability, added a third threat layer operating at sea-skimming altitude. The combined effect was a defensive processing challenge that exceeded the simultaneous engagement capacity of the destroyer's Aegis systems. When a defensive system must track and engage targets arriving simultaneously from high altitude, medium altitude, and sea level from multiple azimuth directions, with different radar signatures and different terminal maneuver characteristics, the number of simultaneous engagement tracks required exceeds the magazine capacity and the fire control processing bandwidth of any currently deployed naval defensive system. This is not a failure of American naval technology in the absolute sense. It is the operational expression of a fundamental asymmetry. Attacking a target with a coordinated multi-axis, multi-altitude, high-volume salvo is structurally less expensive and less technically demanding than defending against one. Iran invested in the offensive capability. The United States invested in the defensive capability, in the engagement geometry of the Strait of Hormuz. The offensive investment produced the more decisive operational outcome. The mobile deployment architecture that Iran used for this engagement is itself a significant capability achievement. Rather than relying on fixed coastal batteries that could be identified, targeted, and destroyed in a preemptive strike, a vulnerability that Iran's military planners recognized and specifically designed around the FARS force was deployed from a combination of hardened coastal sites, mobile transporter erector launcher, vehicles operating from concealed inland positions, and naval platforms, including fast missile boats operating within the strait itself. This distributed mobile posture means that destroying the launch capability requires not a single strike against a known fixed target, but a sustained campaign against a dispersed mobile force that can relocate between firings. The command and control architecture, coordinating the engagement, the targeting data, the fire sequencing, the electronic warfare support that shaped the electromagnetic environment to Iran's advantage during the engagement, represents years of operational development and exercising. This was not a system being used for the first time under combat conditions. It was a system being employed in its intended operational context after extensive preparation and rehearsal. Iran has just validated in the most operationally conclusive way possible that it possesses the capability to deny American surface naval forces freedom of operation in the Strait of Hormuz. The strategic implications of that validation extend far beyond the specific engagement part 3. The Pentagon's paralysis, Washington's response, and the limits of superpower. Power. The paralysis that has gripped the Pentagon in the hours following the loss of 4 destroyers is not the paralysis of incompetence or indecision in the ordinary sense. It is the paralysis of an institution confronted with a decision environment in which every available response option carries costs and risks that its strategic frameworks were never designed to process simultaneously. American military planning for Iranian contingencies has always contained a structural contradiction that planners have managed through deterrence, calibrated signaling, and deliberate ambiguity around escalation thresholds. That contradiction is now fully exposed. The military options available to the United States in response to Iranian aggression fall into 2 broad categories, both deeply problematic. Limited strikes against identified launch sites would satisfy immediate political demands for action and impose localized damage on Iran's missile infrastructure. However, such strikes would not eliminate the dispersed and mobile anti-ship capability that carried out the engagement, nor would they restore lost assets or reopen the Strait of Hormuz. More critically, they would likely provoke retaliatory action calibrated to expand the conflict beyond the initial theater, potentially producing consequences far more severe than the original strike. At the other end of the spectrum, a sustained, large-scale campaign aimed at systematically degrading Iran's military capabilities would require prolonged air and missile operations against a deeply distributed and hardened target set. Underground facilities, mobile launch networks, and layered command and control structures would require sustained engagement over weeks or months, even under optimal conditions. Such an operation would carry high probability of triggering Iran's full regional contingency architecture, maritime mining of the Strait, coordinated missile strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, attacks on U.S. regional bases, and activation of aligned proxy networks across multiple theaters. The economic implications of a full or partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz are immediate and nonlinear. Roughly 1/5 of global oil flows through this corridor, and disruption does not scale in a predictable way. Energy markets respond not only to physical shortages, but to expectations of future instability. A demonstrated capability to disrupt or control this choke point introduces a structural risk premium into global pricing that persists long after any immediate escalation is resolved. Inflationary pressure, financial market volatility, and energy insecurity would transmit across all major importing economies within days. Washington's decision makers are therefore confronted with a response matrix in which no option preserves both strategic stability and political credibility. Every path either fails to reverse the strategic damage or risks amplifying it into a broader regional war. This is the precise type of decision environment that Iran's anti-access strategy is designed to generate. One in which deterrence is not broken through force alone, but through the creation of unacceptable costs for every available response. The domestic political dimension intensifies this dilemma. The loss of major naval assets produces immediate public and congressional pressure for decisive action. Yet acting under political compulsion without a coherent escalation strategy risks transforming a contained crisis into a systemic one. The administration's credibility is tested not only by its willingness to respond, but by its ability to avoid responses that compound the underlying strategic loss. Allies in the Gulf are simultaneously reassessing foundational assumptions. States such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have long structured their security planning around the assumption of reliable U.S. maritime dominance in the Strait of Hormuz. A demonstrated vulnerability in that domain forces a recalibration of regional security architectures, including hedging behaviors, diversification of security partnerships, and accelerated investment in independent deterrent capabilities. The paralysis, however, is not permanent. Large strategic institutions do not remain in stasis for long. Responses will emerge, but they will emerge into a fundamentally altered environment in which deterrence, credibility, escalation, control, and regional influence have already been recalculated by every major actor involved. The strategic landscape has shifted, and the range of viable options has narrowed accordingly. Against this backdrop, Iran's strategic posture reflects a deeply embedded historical conviction regarding its role in the Persian Gulf. This is not a position developed solely in response to contemporary tensions, but one rooted in geography, historical continuity, and long-standing national identity. Iran's northern coastline dominates the critical maritime corridor through which global energy flows, and successive Iranian governments, regardless of ideological orientation, have treated this geographic reality as a permanent strategic fact. From Tehran's perspective, the sustained presence of foreign naval forces in the Gulf is not a neutral security arrangement, but a structural encirclement of Iranian strategic space. The U.S. Fifth Fleet's long-term deployment in Bahrain and the broader network of regional basing arrangements are therefore interpreted not as stabilizing mechanisms, but as persistent instruments of external pressure. Within this framework, Iran's investment in asymmetric maritime capabilities is not reactive in a narrow sense, but the long-term operational expression of a consistent strategic logic. The capability that emerged in the engagement reflects decades of doctrinal development aimed at offsetting conventional naval superiority through distributed, mobile, and multi-layered denial systems. Rather than competing symmetrically with major naval powers, Iran has focused on constructing an environment in which concentrated surface naval operations become increasingly costly and operationally uncertain. This includes ballistic anti-ship systems, cruise missile networks, fast attack craft doctrines, and integrated coastal defense architectures designed for survivability under sustained pressure. From this perspective, the engagement represents not improvisation but validation. A long-developed doctrine of denial has demonstrated its capacity to impose operational constraints on a technologically superior adversary in a confined and strategically vital maritime corridor. The significance of this outcome lies not only in its immediate tactical effects, but in its broader signaling power to regional and global observers. The consequences extend beyond the military domain into the structure of global order itself. Energy markets, maritime insurance systems, and global supply chains are already adjusting to the implications of sustained instability in the Strait of Hormuz. The choke point's importance ensures that even limited disruption generates outsized systemic effects. Risk pricing in global energy markets will now incorporate the possibility of future closure or partial denial as a persistent variable rather than a temporary anomaly. At the geopolitical level, external powers are recalibrating their positions. China, as the largest importer of Gulf energy, faces direct exposure to any prolonged disruption and simultaneously maintains strategic relationships with multiple regional actors. Its potential role as a mediator or stabilizing influence introduces a new layer of multipolar diplomacy into a crisis historically managed through bilateral U.S. dominance. Russia, meanwhile, benefits indirectly through energy price increases and the diffusion of Western strategic attention across multiple theaters. What is emerging is not simply a regional military confrontation, but a broader systemic transition. The assumptions underpinning maritime security, energy stability, and unchallenged power projection are being tested in real